Our panel addressing buildings and architecture, which I'm delighted to say is sponsored by SSE Energy Solutions. SSE Energy Solutions are taking the immediate action we need to achieve net zero and making low emission living achievable for everyone. So the question we're asking our panelists today is what bricks are needed in the new green walls of decarbonised buildings? To both discuss this highly significant area and to share ideas on how we achieve a zero emissions built environment, I'm delighted to introduce our panel, who are Brittany Harris, civil engineer turned tech entrepreneur. As co-founder and CEO of Qflow, Brittany is championing sustainable approaches and connecting people to drive sustainable change across the built environment. Jake Chester, project sales engineer at SSE and a recent graduate with a keen interest in sustainability. John Dunne, safety, environment and quality director at Wales Group, ensuring environmental issues are at the forefront of the largest privately owned construction, development and property services company in the UK, and Sue Riddlestone, who is the CEO of Bioregional, a true pioneer in zero emissions housing and communities and one of the masterminds of London's iconic BedZ eco-village. Thank you all so much for joining us here on the Decarbonisation Summit. This panel is slightly different in that we will start with a short video which comes from a school in the UK, which also has a question in it, which I'll open up to our panel. If we could play out that video, please.
Hello, this question is from Parswood High School in Manchester. We are an 11 to 18 state comprehensive school with about 2,000 students.
In recent years, our student CO2 sustainability team has successfully bid for around £250,000 of external funding to make the school more energy efficient, saving us around £135,000 a year and 630 tonnes of CO2 a year.
The government has encouraged other schools to do the same, but even so, nationally, most schools need to become a lot more energy efficient.
The majority of schools in the UK are old building stock, but replacing them with new energy efficient ones is not a viable option because of the cost and also their inherent carbon. Replacing them would result in a net increase in CO2 emissions. This means the only option is to retrofit them with energy efficiency improvements, which we've shown can be done successfully.
With over 30,000 schools in the UK, the potential CO2 savings are significant, not to mention the opportunity to inspire and educate the next generation. However, this work has taken us 8 years and there's still more we need to do.
So, bearing in mind the deadline for achieving net zero is fast approaching, our question is this. What would the panel do to drastically improve energy efficiency in all UK schools as a matter of urgency? Thank you.
So that video was from Parswood School in Manchester, and their question in that video there was, what would the panel do to drastically improve energy efficiency in UK schools as a matter of urgency? Sue, may I pose that question to you first of all?
Oh, well, I mean, I definitely think that there's something about, obviously, which some of the engineers amongst us here will be able to talk about in terms of we've got to boost the insulation in all of these older schools, which is possible with some of the newer ones, might be difficult with some of the really old pre-1930s buildings. But I'm very much coming from the perspective that it's about how we use the buildings. And so for students, I'd say a quick win could be working on, thinking about keeping the thermostat at the right level, switching things off in the building, and those sort of behaviour change elements, which can massively save energy instantly without even trying. So a sort of student campaign to save energy, and also thinking about how you travel, the carbon in how you travel to school. So more than just the buildings, but how we live and operate and work within the buildings.
Very good. Saadia, you're described as a sustainability polyglot with a strong technology background in engineering and environmental science. What would be your take on that question about UK schools?
I think it's a massive opportunity for a citizen science project. It's a real opportunity to sort of educate students and get them involved in understanding energy management, to get them learning from a young age about the impact of energy management on internal environments, how that affects their comfort levels, ventilation rates, indoor air quality, and how that in turn affects their ability to learn and their levels of alertness. So you know, as Sue said, there's a lot of quick wins. So before you even start to think about any capital expenditure, is there conflict heating and cooling? Are they conditioning spaces when they're not occupied? And, you know, these are the kind of things that you'd normally expect to spend quite a lot of money on with energy audits or post-occupancy evaluations. But if you can engage all of the students to get involved in some of that legwork, you might avoid a costly consultancy fee and get them involved in something at a grassroots level to understand the spaces they're occupying and start doing some of those essentially free measures.
In your work, do you see any of those students being the change makers themselves?
In my work,
yeah,
I haven't worked with any schools,
okay,
but I think at the same time, there's a lot of engagement from the younger generation. There's a massive concern around climate change, and I don't see why they wouldn't want to get involved and learn a little bit more and see what they can do themselves.
John, joining us online, what's your take on that question around UK schools?
Hi everyone. I think it's absolutely fantastic that they're asking the question in the first place. Doesn't that tell us a lot, really? And I think you're absolutely right, following on from that last comment there, you know, that this is where it starts. I actually think the DfE, they're pretty proactive in this space. The latest net zero carbon output specifications of theirs already set ambitious energy use intensity targets. And I think they're already promoting the right principles there. We're really pleased to have started work on 3 schools already from the DfE's 10-year net zero building programme, and the 6 schools that will be working with the modern methods of construction framework. So I think, and there's lots of things that we're looking at as well as part of that framework: passive ventilation, chimneys, mechanical heat recovery systems, even on-site offsetting as well of energy use through biosolar roof systems. We've got an adapt solution. We call it our adapt solution. This is based school, much more sustainable way of building, less waste, higher finisher in quality as well. But then in terms of, I think, of the non-technical approach, in addition to that, the stuff that you inbuilt, as a couple of the panel have said already, you know, let's put energy and carbon on the curriculum. I mean, it's a science in itself, engaging the staff and the pupils so that they can own their own contribution to energy consumption. But I think it's absolutely, it's fantastic. As I said, they're asking this question and they're looking to see in which ways we can improve.
Very good. An idea which came up in an earlier panel was looking at how it's not just technology that's important, but actually the ideas themselves. So putting education on the education agenda around this issue seems like a very good idea, absolutely. Jake, what would be your take on that question around schools and buildings efficiency?
Well, I think Saadia hit the nail on the head, really. The primary thing we should be looking at is the control of the building. It's finding areas where the heating is fighting the cooling. It's finding areas where there isn't sufficient occupancy control and you're ending up heating or conditioning spaces that aren't occupied. One in particular I'd like to talk about is demand-controlled ventilation. So obviously ventilation has been quite frequently spoken about since COVID. People are aware of how important it is to properly ventilate a space in terms of reducing the concentration of germs in the air. But the problem you have with this is that you're bringing in a lot of fresh air from the outside, which then needs to be tempered and conditioned and heated, and that's quite energy intensive. So when you're installing CO2 sensors in a space, you're able to strike that balance between energy efficiency, occupant safety, and occupant comfort. And you're able to provide an environment that's safe for students to learn, that's going to minimise the risk of COVID transmission, but also reduce the energy use to the minimum level it needs to be. The government's actually recently purchased 250,000 carbon dioxide sensors for schools, but unfortunately they're not smart sensors. They can't output that data to a central building management system in order to influence ventilation rates and really drive change. I think that was quite a missed opportunity. So taking another look at that, another look at demand control ventilation could really make a difference.
Very good. Brittany, what would be your take on this question?
It's an interesting one. I think you've all pulled out really great points, and I love that the kids highlighted that, you know, just knocking it down and starting again isn't, you know, a great option right now because we embody so much carbon in our buildings, and you know, starting from scratch isn't necessarily the right way. And I know John at Wates, they're working a lot on building new buildings, and it's really important that as we do build new stock within this, that as we embody that carbon, we're making sure that we can take those buildings apart and retrofit them appropriately as new technology comes online. And part of that does come down to the data. So obviously with Qflow, we're really keen on firstly knowing what's going into buildings so that we can introduce those materials back into the circular economy, but also using that data to really drive change and efficiency as we go through. So knowing what level of insulation you've got, or what sort of HVAC or sort of air quality control systems you've got in place, so that you can start thinking about how to tweak those buildings as we move through this process of decarbonising. And I think one of the lovely things about data is that you can engage students in that in a really qualitative way as well as a quantitative way, and actually say, right, what can we learn from these numbers and how can we use them to move forward? And I know from a lot of the STEM outreach stuff that we do that there's a much stronger appetite for the qualitative side of carbon and decarbonising and climate change, but that qualitative piece has got to be really backed up by that data as well. And so having the data will help them push that through, and it makes maths more interesting.
Very good, good. We'll come back to that embodied carbon piece a little later. But I'd like to just go around the panel now and ask you all a little bit about your work and what you're doing within your work to decarbonise within your companies and your businesses. Sue, would you like to take a first stab at that one, please?
Sure, thanks. So I'm from Bioregional. We've been working for more than 25 years now, especially looking at how we live out, the impact that our lives have on nature and the planet. So the approach that we take, we call it One Planet Living, where we think about our modern day lives that everybody around the world aspires to, mean that if everyone lived like we do, we'd need 3 planets to support us, if you take into account the resources and the carbon. So what we're all about is one planet living, where we can all live happy, healthy lives, wherever we live in the world, within the natural limits of our planet, and leave space for nature, very importantly, as well. We rely a lot on nature to suck up the carbon, as well as the fact that it has an intrinsic right to exist. So we work on zero carbon buildings which enable one planet living. I live at our sort of flagship initial project you mentioned, Bedsteads in South London. We were actually on TV with Joanna Lumley last week, which was brilliant. And so I'm living in a zero carbon home, so living the life there. And since we've worked on that, we've worked on in a sort of advisory capacity all around the world, where developers can apply this thinking, and we used it for the Olympics sustainability strategy as well, and that turned out nicely. And we also work a bit with local governments on creating zero carbon plans for their area, zero carbon policies, and with retailers like B&Q in the UK, for example, who big home and garden improvement retailer, on how they can actually achieve one planet living themselves, but also help their customers to achieve one planet living. So we're a social enterprise, we're a charity, very purpose-led. So everything we do is about decarbonising and, circular economy and giving nature a boost. So it very much part of our lives, and we use that to change policy and practice. So, for example, working, helping the government when answering all their consultations and giving them advice on, what can work, and also working on international policy like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which we had a formal role in. So it's kind of real things that you can look at, because if we can show that the future is attractive, that this is a better way to live, then everyone will sort of run towards it and feel like this is something we can aspire to, rather than something we just sort of, oh dear, we don't want to sort of cut back our lifestyle 2/3.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you've certainly done that with Bedstead. I mean, it's a real exemplar of a sustainable buildings approach, isn't it? We actually did some filming there at GreenTV ourselves a few weeks ago, but sadly not with Joanna Lumley. But perhaps that will happen in the future. Saadia, tell us a little bit more about what you do and what you're doing to decarbonise within your company.
Sure. So I'm a consultant at 3Adapt. We're a very small consultancy in Bath. There's only 8 of us. But our whole remit is to have very people-focused and data-centric solutions for this sort of changing world. And in terms of broader sustainability and decarbonisation, we're not primarily focused on carbon. We do like to look at things holistically, and often use sustainability models like the 6 capitals of sustainability, so looking at natural, social, human, intellectual, manufactured and financial aspects of sustainability. So really looking at things in the round so that they are workable solutions for our clients that, you know, don't sort of favour any particular solution at the detriment of another potential sustainable gain. In terms of the kind of projects we work on, we kind of are very broad. We're kind of, across our team, we cover a lot of different skill sets. So, you know, we're looking at land change and peatland restoration and the impacts on flooding, the impact on carbon sequestration, lots of other sort of woodland creation projects as well. So working with the Woodland Carbon Code there to help quantify that. As an organisation ourselves, we have quantified our own carbon footprint. I did that. And part of that was almost to use ourselves as a test bed to kind of think, well, we want to make sure that we can do it for ourselves so that we're informing clients as best as we can, having those conversations about offsets, looking at the best ones available, looking at the best abatement possibilities to reduce our own emissions. We have done quite a few decarbonisation pathways now for different organisations, which have been really exciting, and it's really nice to work with organisations like the V&A, and we've now started projects with English Heritage, and yeah, it's really fun to work in a space where everyone's really switched on and keen, but not necessarily aware of the best course of action. So it's really empowering to sort of help people, especially large organisations, to not only decarbonise their scope 1 and 2, but really look at their scope 3 as well, their whole footprint, their whole organisation, and look at where they can make savings. But on the whole, we try and look at those aspects in a broader sustainable realm to as I say, not kind of, you know, favour carbon over other impacts. And it's you know, you don't want this kind of carbon tunnel syndrome where you're looking at something that might be sort of negatively impact another, something like biodiversity, for example, or water quality or social welfare. So yeah, we're kind of polyglots as a team, I would say, but it's a good space to be in to look at things holistically.
Very good, thank you. John, I know there's a huge scope of work you could discuss here, but if you wouldn't mind just taking 1 minute to give a quick tour of the work at Wates Group on decarbonisation. What are some of the highlights that you're working on within Wates?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is so much. Where do you start? I guess the first thing I'd say is what we're trying to do at Wates is we're trying to normalise this agenda. We're trying to make it very, very sort of simple for people to follow and understand. And we've got to get people behind it. We created a campaign, Changing Our Habits, which was all about what people can do as individuals and what we can do as an organisation. We set ourselves 3 very ambitious targets to achieve by 2025. One of those is to eliminate all of our emissions, scope 1 and 2, by 2025, and that's dealing with on-site plant as well as our own sort of vehicle fleet, which is 400 plus vehicles. We want to sort of turn those into an electric fleet by the time we get to 2025, making sure we've got all the right infrastructure in place. We're also looking at sort of biodiversity, nature, positive by 2025, and zero waste. So there's a huge amount of we're trying to do internally as well. And then we're trying to work with as many customers as we can. We're trying to set ourselves up as the low carbon contractor of choice, really, the organisation that can help our own customers reach their own targets as well. So there is a huge amount, and a lot of it is about sort of getting the right sort of.
As we seem to have lost John there, I'll skip on to
technical subjects to a certain extent. There's a lot of language.
John, we lost you for a second there, but thanks for that quick tour. We certainly got the main thrust of it. Jake, returning to SSE, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing within the business to decarbonise, please.
Sure. So I work for SSE Smart Buildings. We are the division of SSE that focuses on building management systems. Building management systems is one of those things that most people will encounter on a day-to-day basis, but they don't really know exists. I like to think of it as like the central nervous system of a building. So it's taking a series of inputs and outputs and using these to maintain the conditions that you want in a building, so temperature, humidity, CO2, all these things we've spoken about already. So on a very basic level, we might be looking at really old building management systems, 20 plus years old, that are sort of quite dilapidated. We might be helping customers to upgrade these to make sure they're configured in the most energy efficient way possible, to make sure, for example, that a sensor that's meant to be measuring the outside air temperature is actually outside and is actually measuring the temperature it's meant to be measuring. And then as we're sort of moving forward into the smart buildings realm, we're looking to bring together as much information from as much different systems as we can, not just your traditional building management systems, and then using those to really drive energy efficiency improvements. So for example, you might have a room booking system where you can book out a meeting room, and then you might be able to precondition that room so that you're getting the temperatures only for the periods where that room's actually going to be occupied. So it's bringing in lots of disparate systems all together and using that information to drive changes in terms of energy efficiency and carbon reduction.
Very good. So going back to that schools question, you might have some smart energy solutions to sell into the schools sector, it seems, perhaps. Brittany, tell us about what you're doing to decarbonise within your business.
Yeah, so Qflow is a software company. We developed a tool called Qflow that helps the construction industry to track all the materials coming onto site and all the waste going off. So we work with contractors, including Wates, but also Bouygues UK, but also developers like Landsec and Great Pool and Estates. And the main focus of that is really to help them capture and manage their scope 3, so understanding really what's going on within their supply chain, where are there changes beyond what was designed and planned, but also make sure as they come to the end of life of that building, beyond the operation, can they repurpose aspects of that? So as we are taking raw resources out of the ground and putting it into our infrastructure, can we try and maximise the value that we're getting from that and minimise our future impact by saying, right, we're going to keep those doors and we're going to use them somewhere else, so we're going to keep that steel and we're going to make sure we're repurposing it, and really trying to keep everything right at the top of the waste hierarchy, so that reuse as much as possible. And you can't do that without the data and knowing what's actually in your buildings. So Qflow just makes it incredibly easy, pain-free and efficient to capture all that information and then start reusing it across all of your different types of construction infrastructure.
Very good. Thank you very much, everyone, for those opening gambits. We'll come back to think about how you might share some knowledge and ideas with each other at the end of the panel. But to get stuck into some heavyweight questions and to think about the speed that we need to adopt to deliver on decarbonisation, my question is, industry experts say that 20 to 30% of emissions could be saved right now. So why isn't this happening? John, maybe I'll pitch this one to you now. Why aren't we saving on those emissions right now?
Very, very quickly, I'd say, and I think we've mentioned it a few times already, data and knowledge sharing is absolutely essential. We need to see more of this if we're going to reach net zero. We recently chaired a health industry roundtable launching the Decarbonising Health Estates, a partnership with Arup and HKS Architects. It's really clear that we've got to find out more information, actually where are the areas that we absolutely need to target. Knowledge, capability, skills don't exist right now, and we need to sort of upskill people to meet this requirement. The industry isn't joined up enough. We need developers, main contractors, supply chains, and customers to be joined up. We're trying, we've made a start, but we've got more work to do. If we look at the Construction Leadership Council's ambitions to tackle transport, building, construction activity, they account for 43% of the UK's emissions. And we've just got to work closer together. That's why it's not happening right now. I wouldn't say it's stopping us, it's just delaying us. We're trying and we're figuring out how we need to approach it, but we've got to get more joined up.
Sue and Brittany, you're nodding vigorously to that. Which one of you would like to respond to that?
Be kind.
I don't know about why not. I'm just thinking about, I always think, what do we need to do? And I think we've had sort of saturation media coverage with the COP26 going on here in Glasgow. And if everyone doesn't know this is something they need to do something about, then they obviously never listen to any media. So I think there's going to be a lot of people who want to take action now, and we all need to, capitalise on that and make sure, if anyone's watching, the UN says we need to halve global carbon emissions by 2030. And on Thursday at Cities and Buildings Day, the UN are going to call for halving building energy emissions globally by 2030. This is something like industry-wide experts have come up with. And all new buildings should be zero carbon, and that's something in the UK that's going to start from 2025, and the UN is saying globally it needs to be by 2030. So you know, we've really all got to take action on this, and I think it's a massive opportunity. And the technologies are all there. Look at these great, you know, all of us great experts can help you with it, but the information is out there and it's not rocket science. So I think hopefully the COP will give it a big boost.
So, I mean, this question is about speed, and 2030 is 8 very short years away. Are you optimistic that that level of speed, that range, that timeline will be met?
Who, me?
Yeah, with your sense of what's going on here at 26?
Well, you might as well have a big target to aim for. Look what we achieved when we got into the pandemic emergency. Look what we've achieved in a year or two. And there's been many experiments. Yes, I know the COP's been going on for 26 years, but during all that time, a lot of people have been learning what we need to do about this all over the world, wherever you go. So I think we've done enough sort of piloting, and now we just need to mainstream this. So I think there's every opportunity, but it does need all of us to get on with it every day and not to be working on non-net zero carbon projects, really. Can persuade the clients, you know.
I think, like, I mean, you've made 100% good points there, and John, you mentioned it as well. I think we know that stuff needs to happen. We pretty much know what needs to happen, but it's that piece about collaboration and I think leadership. So I mean, we've seen what our government here in the UK is saying, that we want, you know, the capital markets, capitalism to drive decarbonisation. Now, you may have your own opinions on that, but really what that is calling for is someone to take leadership, and it has to be the clients, it has to be the contractors, it has to be the developers. It kind of has to be everyone within the supply chain to take their own point of leadership and collaborate and work together. And one thing that we've definitely seen at our end is that data is helping to do that. Because I think there is still this aspect of confusion. We know that there are technologies and there are approaches and, you know, consulting approaches that can really help us deliver that, but we're not quite sure which one to do when and where we're going to get the greatest return on our investment in terms of decarbonising. And so data can really help do that. You can see tiny tweaks in your airflow system that will actually massively improve the energy efficiency of your building, but until you have the data, it's really hard to see that. So I think, yes, in terms of speed, we can do it today. We need to not, you know, continually flounder around, well, what do we do? Just do something, measure it as you're doing it, and then make sure that you're using that data to inform your next decision. I think the lack of leadership is genuinely crippling everyone right now. It needs someone to just go, yeah, we're going to try this, we're going to measure it, and then we're going to make another decision after that. But not making a decision is a complete waste of time and money, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Very, very good. Jake, your take on that?
Yeah, I think collaboration is crucial. I think our leaders don't always lead by example, which is a shame. I think that would definitely help. I think, you know, the sense of the country pulling together through COVID, the sense that we're all in this together while that lasted, really helps. And I think we need a similar sort of response because we're facing a similar sort of emergency. It might be over a longer period of time and not so immediately obvious, but this is an emergency. This is something that requires an emergency response, and that means top to bottom through the supply chain, as been mentioned.
Saadia, your thoughts on this topic?
I think it's a bit more convoluted. The appetite is certainly there to save energy. I think when it comes to technology, people expect the technology to do everything for them. And fair enough, if you've got something like energy as a service, perhaps that is possible. But when it comes to throwing more technology in buildings, I think people underestimate the potential of that technology, and they expect the technology to do the behaviour change as well. You know, people have to interact with these different devices. They have to understand what the devices are telling them, like smart meters, for example, and they have to change their behaviour. And we've seen through academic studies, through my consultancy work as well, that just behaviour change can save 20 to 30% of energy. So, you know, that's something that everyone can do, but it's difficult to change behaviour when we have habits. On the other hand as well, if we look at the incentives at sort of UK level to save energy, they're not really there. So as a comparison, if we look at neighbours in Australia, they have completely transformed the building sector, because what they did is they said, okay, you've got a 5-star neighbours rated building, you can charge a premium for your rent. What that's then resulted in is the whole sector upping its game, from sort of the contractors just sort of installing systems to the construction, to the consultancy around it, to the landlords. Everyone's interested in making these buildings more efficient because they can charge more rent. And that's one mechanism. And that has come to the UK. We have got Neighbours UK now. And fair enough, I think it is just for offices at the moment. I might be wrong about that. But you know, it's a really effective mechanism that's proven. And it's taken 20 odd years in Australia, but their building stock is massively, like, it's light years ahead of ours in the UK. But actually their buildings themselves, they've done retrofit and they've done new build. There's no reason we can't use that as an example to change our building stock. So I kind of feel like, as with all of these things, it's a socio-technical problem, and everyone, you know, there's a shared responsibility across the board. As individuals, we have to change our behaviour. We have to learn more about how to manage buildings and the energy within them. But also, as in the building sector, we need to find more creative solutions to encourage the whole sector to up its game.
It is a shift in culture and behaviour for the industry, though, because that's what you're describing there as a race to the top instead of the race to the bottom. And typically within construction and the built environment, we've sort of run this race to the bottom kind of mentality of trying to be as cheap as possible. And John, you mentioned it earlier, you know, you want Wates to be the go-to partner for low carbon construction. That is a race to the top. That is a massive change in culture and behaviour in the building side of building our infrastructure. So I totally agree, but it's so interesting to see that happen.
And I think there's another thing that's going to help us add to the scale and pace. So that's the market forces and policy and regulation. With the zero carbon, stricter building regulations coming in for the new build, but also for rental properties, it's going to just put pressure on. But also, one of the things I think is just most wonderful about that's been launched at this COP26 is the Glasgow Finance Declaration, where 2/3 of financial institutions have committed to net zero. And so they're going to be looking for things to invest in to justify their pledge. So you know, they're going to be reaching out to the developers, the construction industry. They'll be offering green mortgages with preferential rates because they need to show that they're taking action. So I think that's a real opportunity to help us get cracking.
We began the day looking at the investment piece, and the flows of capital into this sector are very, very clear and apparent.
Yeah.
We've discussed technology, we've discussed new ideas. Let's move on to a question from our online audience. The question's coming in nicely now, and this one's about building materials. The question is, what alternative sustainable building materials, such as hemp bricks, might be used in the buildings of the future? How can we make these building materials more marketable for developers? Maybe Sue, would you like to have a first answer to that one?
One of our partners, Greencore Saadia Properties, have built a fantastic development in Oxfordshire, and they had this great idea of wood panels with hemp and lime in the middle. So, you know, you can fire a blowtorch at it. It doesn't go up in flames. It's a good product. So, and it's carbon negative. So it literally sucks in carbon once you've built. And 70% of the impact of construction is in the construction materials. So this is a really important area to tackle. And so really great to hear Brittany talking about it. So, you know, that is definitely one product. And what I'd like to see is, I'm always saying to them, you know, what you need is a big factory. You know, they need to talk to those people who've declared, bankers who've declared net zero, to get some investment to build some bigger factories and really get cracking. And, you know, I'm sure Brittany will have a lot more to say on, you know, building for deconstruction either, and seeing it all as value locked up that you can use again. So I think there are a lot of opportunities out there. I think it's been unfortunate that because of the terrible tragedy at Grenfell, it's almost put up a sort of a negative feeling about building with wood, but there's no reason why building with wood cannot be fire safe. It is fire safe, and it wouldn't be allowed to be built otherwise.
Brittany, what's your take on the use of creative new materials to decarbonise the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear John's thoughts on this as they actually do the building. But I mean, particularly, we get asked so many times, because we had on the sort of data side, we get asked by other sort of innovative companies who are producing these materials, how can we get in front of these guys and how can we get them comfortable with using this? I think it kind of comes back to that regulation and legislation piece. It's actually really hard to get new materials certified. There's this amazing company that we know really well called Biome. They've just got massive investment from a major supermarket to build a plant in a really high poverty area in the UK. So they're creating jobs, they're producing these amazing materials out of mycelium, which is a type of mushroom, and it's got these insane thermal qualities, so it literally won't burn. So from a fire safety thing, it's incredible, incredible insulation, and they're building for it to be modular so they can take it apart. And it's just this awesome company, but they're finding it really hard to get certified as being okay to be used in buildings. And there are loads of other companies who are looking at low carbon concretes, new timber structures, like cross laminates, like, there's so much out there, but they just can't get out on site right now because there is this blocker around, is it safe? Is it accepted? Because there's no doubt that they are safe. Realistically, they've been put through the ringers, but they can't get certified for contractors to be comfortable to put them in the buildings or for the clients and the designers to sign it off. And then, again, it kind of comes back to that leadership piece, both from clients to say, I'm happy with this level of risk, I understand the parameters within that, but I'm going to push forward this low carbon material, and for the government to just tear down some of those barriers. I know RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, have been looking at how they really help lead this point, but it's tough, it's really tough, but a lot of it's down to bureaucracy, not to supply.
Very good. Tearing down barriers, being mindful of embedded carbon, let's hope. John, you're one of the large legacy organisations in the sector. Are you looking at the creative use of materials at Wates Group?
We are, absolutely. I feel for Brittany there. That was very impassioned plea, I think. I think a bit of faith. That's what a bit of faith. And Brittany's probably one of these. 95% of market-ready sustainable technologies never get considered because they just can't get to reach the key decision makers, and they don't get access to those people. And if we're going to encourage smarter solutions to design, construct, and maintain buildings, we've got to bridge that gap. One of the things we've done to help, actually, we've developed what we call our Wates Innovation Network, and we launched that earlier this year. And this is an intelligent marketplace that identifies sustainable technologies, and it puts those technologies in direct contact with sort of future customers. And I must say, one of our real proactive customers is Lloyds Bank. Certainly they're looking at many of these technologies and they're looking to trial them. They're putting a bit of faith into that type of technology, into their existing portfolio. So it's fantastic to see. And then we've also got other customers like Land Securities. We're working on one of their major projects in London. And if you look at some of the sort of materials and techniques we're using there, 98% of the rebar is recycled. We're using Welsh slate instead of sort of Spanish, saving around 62,000 kilograms CO2 equivalent, lightweight concrete floors, cement replacement products in the substructure, in the core concrete, and as well as targeting lower levels of waste. So there's quite a few things we're doing. We're not moving quick enough. We need a bit more faith, and we need people to just accept that let's give some of these new materials a go.
Just to say, with Landsec, they're a really great example of a client that is pushing boundaries and leading the way. They've raised some capital from Innovate UK, so they've got some grant funding to de-risk that innovation and really make it possible. But they're also making a really concerted effort to then share that learning with the industry and say, look, we've done it. It was worth the time and the money. It was worth the sort of massive sort of increase in rents that they can charge in terms of office space because they are so green, but also just from their profile, people are really starting to see them as the leaders there. And so the more leadership we have from big clients like Landsec, the more we're going to see that change.
And one way for your people to make an impact, so this is what Greencore did, they actually had to set up their own property development company in order to demonstrate their product. So yeah, that is how tough it can be. So we need that all to be accelerated. Leadership
and knowledge sharing coming through as two key themes in this panel then. Jake, on the creative use of buildings materials at SSE, what do you see in that space?
Well, I'm not really an expert on building materials. I'm more focused on the control of buildings, so I'm going to leave the experts to talk about that. But I can
control of buildings, perhaps?
Oh yeah, there's absolutely creative ways of controlling. It's all about, like I was saying earlier, it's about bringing in information from sources that you wouldn't normally traditionally bring into a BMS and then finding ways to generate actionable insights because of that. I'd just like to talk about what Brittany mentioned with regards to the sort of bureaucracy that gets in the way. That's something that I've noticed as well. Certainly in the public sector procurement process is very arduous, very long-winded, and the people who've got to procure this stuff, they don't have unlimited bandwidth. There's only got certain projects they can deal with. And quite often, if emergencies happen, energy efficiency products energy efficiency solutions fall by the wayside. So, you know, the procurement process in the public sector needs to be much more fit to purpose for the emergency that we're facing, like it was during COVID. I think that's something that needs to be improved.
Creative use of materials in the procurement process. Perhaps a bit of an oxymoron, but something to be worked on. Saadia, in your work, do you see any use of building materials in a creative way to deliver on decarbonisation?
I've not massively worked on projects that are overhauling fabric to this sort of extent, but I have to say I'm all for it. I'm quite sick and tired of seeing more glass boxes being constructed, more glass skyscrapers where they've got absolutely no idea how to deconstruct them and reuse the materials. You look at the Burj Khalifa, it's the kind of poster child for something like that. How do you ever bring that apart and reuse those materials? I have no idea. But yeah, I mean, there's just there's so many barriers to having these kind of rolled out mainstream. It's a bit of a shame, really, because as sort of John said, you know, the technologies are there, the solutions are there, they've been there for some time. It's just I don't know, how do we get them rolled out at scale?
Very good.
For people who like think about their own homes, there's a wonderful network, which the website is a bit up and down in terms of is it up or is it down, but Old Home Super Home. And one of the projects I know about there, she used a cork wall, cork on the outside of the wall of a very old building. So a really natural material that is sustainably harvested, rather than just some sort of synthetic external wall insulation. So there's all sorts of things out there.
Very good. Moving on from construction to demolition, and to touch on the embedded carbon question that we alluded to earlier. So 11% of emissions come from embedded carbon relating to the construction and demolition of a building. How do we reduce waste in that process? Brittany, would you like to take a first go at that one?
I mean, the first way is build for deconstruction. And this is not new. This has been talked about for 50 years plus. It's obscene. I mean, the one industry that does do it quite well is the nuclear industry. Not because they're planning on reusing anything, but because they have a massive problem when they take apart a nuclear power plant. And it's something that we just don't really think about properly in the sort of civil engineering and construction space. We build for it to stand up, make sure it doesn't fall down, and then sort the rest. And actually the best way to eliminate waste is make sure that you're not generating it in the first place, because you can just keep using it. And a room like this is a fantastic example. You've got, I don't know, maybe 10 doors. The design life of a door is maybe 25 years. And you might refit this building in 5 years' time because you want to move it around to be something else. You might want private offices, or you might actually turn it into a residential block. What's going to happen to those doors? Are you going to send them to landfill, which is normally what happens, or can you actually repurpose them in another building halfway across Glasgow? And actually creating those circular markets and making sure that we have a clear picture of what's in our buildings and what is available for reuse and the sort of quality of them is such a key part of actually being able to make sure we eliminate waste and massively, massively reduce the embodied carbon of our assets.
Very good. Jake, I know you work for SSE, but I won't ask you what's going to happen to the doors in 25 years' time. I'm not sure that's part of it.
I'll come back and check.
It's not quite what unfortunately.
John, over to you on that one, the embedded carbon piece from a Wates perspective. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I think just to answer the sort of waste question, I think we've got to work harder at it. You know, construction contributes over a third of the UK's total yearly amount of waste, and it has to start with education around the benefits of recycling and reusing materials. We have to think about designing in ways of reducing waste in the first place, taking into account the standard size of materials, for example, which, designing rooms and facilities that fit standard size, so we're absolutely eliminating waste in the first place. And then in recent years, we've seen much more of a move towards building off-site. So off-site manufacturing, modern methods of construction, and this dramatically helps us reduce our waste by applying, really what you're doing is applying manufacturing processes where every piece of material costs money. Getting out of the habit of just over-ordering, just in case mentality. So we've got better planning. And one of the things actually I'd really like to mention is we've just introduced our reuse marketplace. It's an organisation called GlobeChain, and we've put that in right across the business, and that's going to help us to redistribute any unneeded items that we have on our projects in our offices.
So Sue, I know you've been involved in some of the more creative constructions over recent years. What's your take on that embedded carbon question?
Well, I think there are types of buildings where you can take them down and reuse them. So when we worked on the London 2012 Olympics, my colleague Ronan went on site and surveyed all the buildings that were on there. It was quite an industrial area, and I think it was 7, or maybe was it 10? There was a number of buildings that were able to be taken down and re-erected as buildings because they've become those tin shed type buildings. And I think also the talk around the COP26 amongst the architects is we've just got to look at repurposing existing buildings, because knocking down buildings and building a new one has such massive impact that people have just really started to appreciate. And if you look at how it all adds up, you know, a certain amount of repurposing and reusing and refurbishing buildings is going to be necessary to achieve net zero carbon 2050.
I think coming back to your point earlier as well, Saadia, in terms of the behaviour change and the cultural change, that massively comes into it, because we have gotten into this habit as a people, as a humanity, that we love new, shiny stuff that is exactly to our tastes, that has never been touched by anyone else before. And there's this weird subculture coming out where it's like, I'm definitely part of it, so forgive me, but where it's like everything has to be circular. So I'm trying to redo my kitchen at the moment, and I'm like endlessly scouring Facebook Market and Gumtree to try and find secondhand units and be like, it will not be new. But there needs to be that cultural change where we say, actually, we're okay with using something that someone else has used, and that it's not brand new, and that it might not be, you know, within the millimetre of what we expected, but it's good enough and it's functional. And so there does have to be this mind shift of, we don't need to buy new stuff every single time. We can actually go out and find repurposed items.
Yeah, and in my kitchen, the same thing. In my kitchen at Bedshead, we deliberately bought plywood and, you know, solid wood for the kitchens, and it does break my heart a bit when some of my neighbours are pulling them out. But the idea is, you know, you can sand it down, revarnish it, paint it a different colour if you want to switch it up a bit, but don't just automatically design things for a longevity, and all, including the interior fittings, so that they can be improved upon and not ripped out and chucked away.
Yeah, I think as well, just to sort of add to that.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Saadia, you carry on. John, we'll come to you in a second, John.
Just around, if it does have to be new, perhaps we can embrace modern methods of construction, and, you know, right from the start of the design process, even from sort of inception brief, think about, well, can I design this space so that I don't have to cut a brick in half in order to, for that length of building or whatever? Can I have prefab? Can I construct things off-site and then just put them together on-site so that I can be more efficient with my material use? That there's kind of, as much as we have to reuse, absolutely, renovate, definitely. But if it does have to be new, just think about it a bit more intelligently from the beginning, right from the beginning, from the start, to kind of think, well, I don't want all of this construction waste. I don't want to over-order. I don't want to have a construction site where I've got a whole pile of bricks cut in half that I can't use again because they've been cut at an angle or whatever it is. Like, we have to kind of just be a little bit more intelligent about how we're using the materials available to us.
Technology's helping with that as well. I've started to see, you know, I've only been in the job 18 months, but I'm already starting to see a trend towards more wireless-based solutions that allow for easier reconfiguration. You're not having to get electrical installers in to go through the ceiling and tear all the wires out. You can just literally move the sensors around, move the light fittings around, and reconfigure that way.
Very good. Let's move on to a question about accessibility and the democratisation of decarbonisation. So the question is, you know, perhaps more and more people are being denied access to affordable houses. How do we align decarbonisation goals with the UK's current housing crisis? Sue, would you like to have a...
Well, funnily enough, registered social housing providers have the best standards in terms of energy efficiency of the buildings, because a big issue for them is fuel poverty, where residents who are on a low income, so therefore their fuel bills will form a much larger proportion of their expenditure. So there's a real driver there and a motivation for social landlords. But I think the real issue is where people are stuck in private rent. And there is legislation by the government that private landlords do have to improve the energy efficiency. I think it's to level C from, I think it was you know, it's already in place, that legislation. So I think it's about, you know, local authorities are a bit sort of strapped for cash and resources, but it would be good if they could check up on landlords and make sure that homes were being not let out. But it's something that estate agents could play a role. Any estate agents watching, you know, make sure your landlords are offering properties fit to rent. And I know my own children, you know, as students, lived in the most appalling accommodation. They weren't very well off, and they all had loads of jumpers on, and my daughter got pneumonia at one point. So, you know, so it is a really serious issue. And there are a lot of, the government is currently focusing a lot of the grants for upgrading properties on the poorer people in our society, so that's good.
John, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge, really. If you think about the sort of, you know, recent data, at least 19 million of the 29 million homes in the UK need to be retrofitted if we're going to meet the sort of the government's 2050 targets. My maths isn't great, but that's about 3 homes every minute, I think, up to the sort of 2050. So it's an absolutely huge task. So we're going to have to look at another way of sort of meeting that. You know, 300,000 new homes a year isn't going to get us out of it, get us out of this problem. We're going to have to look at sort of repurposing existing buildings. You know, look at the sort of building. I mean, if you look at the high street now, how that's sort of slowly disappearing. What are we doing with all this space? What are those sort of existing landowners doing? And I know a number of them are looking at those and then thinking how they can certainly turn them into a sort of build to rent option. And then you've got a great opportunity to use those existing buildings and retrofit them in a very sustainable way.
Jake, what do you see at SSE going on in this decarbonisation space for a wider, more inclusive sector?
I was going to agree exactly what John says. It's the retrofitting existing buildings that is, I think, the best solution here. You don't always have to build new housing. It's an option that's needed, but when there are so many buildings in the city centre that already exist, then let's look at repurposing them for housing. And plus, the infrastructure already exists around them there. When you're building sort of out in the cities, you're also having to construct transport links and shops and all this kind of thing. But if you're repurposing old buildings that are already in the area they need to be, and you can really improve the housing stock.
From recycling plywood kitchens to recycling entire buildings, very good. Saadia, your take on this one?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what's been said. I think if I was to add to it, then if we do have to build new houses, which we know we kind of do, perhaps we could have a look at, I mean, perhaps this is a little bit controversial, but at the moment, you know, developers are building houses. There's no real incentive for those to be energy efficient. There's no real incentive for those to be low carbon. They're not penalised if they aren't. And they're not always affordable. So perhaps if local councils went back to building houses instead of rolling these out to developers, then they would not have to, you know, you look at developers, they're making about a 30% profit maybe. But if the local councils were building them themselves, maybe that 30% profit could go back into making those buildings more energy efficient and more affordable for people that really need them.
Very good. We'll do one more question, then I'll ask you all to...
Can I just add on that? I think there's another side to this sort of housing shortage. Someone said to me the other day, we don't have a lack of houses, we just have them in the wrong place. And there was a really interesting article that came out about 5 years ago where a community in Northern Ireland had built around 1,000 houses, and they were all empty. No one was living there. They'd been built and then they'd never been sold because they'd built them in an area where there was no sort of economy, there was no jobs, and so they'd literally been a ghost village. There was about five houses that were occupied. And we have a similar thing here in sort of the England space. I've got a friend who lives in Liverpool, and there's a huge number of houses that are being sold for £1 because they need someone to own them and live in them. At the moment, they're completely empty, and they're just becoming derelict, and they're not being cared for. So we do actually have quite a lot of houses in the UK. They're just in the wrong place. So maybe the issue is not necessarily to build loads of new houses, but actually to move our economic centres out of London and out of some of the other sort of big hubs, and actually encourage more economic growth and more jobs in areas where there is a larger housing stock and there is opportunity for people to live more balanced lives.
Rather than ask rather than me ask a question, maybe I'll ask the rest of the panel your question. Do we have the right number of houses but in the wrong places? Saadia, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, maybe the MOD have quite a large portfolio, and there's a lot of empty houses there, and they're not in sort of, you know, the Londons, they're out in Corsham or somewhere, you know, in the middle of the country. But if we can start to make those parts of the country a bit more attractive to live, perhaps we can have people in houses instead of homeless.
Do you think there's, maybe John here, do you think there's a vector here whereby, you know, builders and developers don't want to address this point because perhaps there's not so much economic incentive to do so? Do you think that's the case?
No, I really don't. I mean, I don't know too many sort of developments that aren't sort of attracting people to live in. I think most of the developments I know in the places where we're building sort of and developing homes, there's a huge demand for them anyway, and they're quickly filled up. The problem we have at the moment is actually is being able to find places to build new homes. There's, I mean, planning, rightly so, has a number of restrictions around biodiversity. And then you've also got to look at water neutrality issues now in places that are preventing sort of planning to build new homes. So people that are in areas that are requiring and demand homes just can't get them quick enough. And then on the MOD point, it's a really valid point, and actually that is happening. The MOD is looking at existing properties that they have and seeing how they can repurpose those into making them available to the wider community.
I think just to add to that, sorry, Sue, do you want to go?
Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, when it comes to perhaps social housing as well, what's really important is to make sure that those houses are suitable for the people that need to occupy them. So my sister, for example, works as an inspector for social housing, and she goes in and looks at a lot of new build and kind of goes, oh, hang on a second, this is meant to be for a family of 5, and you're telling me that this is a 3-bed house, but actually 2 of those are box rooms, and how do you possibly expect someone to put a bed in there and all their furniture? You can barely get a single bed in there. So the sort of the quality of houses that are being offered as well, they just have to be appropriate for people that want to live in them and need them. And kind of looking at it in the round, this, you know, looking at the wider sustainability aspects of it, is it a nice place to live? Does it have all of the amenities that people need? Does it have a nice, like, quality, like a nice realm? Is there safe spaces for children to play? Are they going to be running out onto the road? You know, are there nice green spaces? It's not just about the building itself, it's about a community and creating spaces for people to really exist and live. I
completely agree with you, and I mean that was a point when you talked about location, that was what a point I really wanted to get across, that it's really important where we build our homes in order to make it easy for people to live a zero carbon lifestyle. One of the issues is we're not being efficient in our use of land where we've built homes. We need to sort of densify up a bit, live a bit closer together, not have this sort of sprawl of executive homes on the land that we are building. Because then what we need to do is build in places where it's easy for people to walk to the shops, to the school, to a train station, to have the infrastructure to enable us to live zero carbon lives. So it's about much, much more than just zero carbon built buildings, you know, like the physical building. It's how we build them so that, you know, is it easy to have your bicycle just inside the front door, de-emphasising roads, creating community where the kids can go out to play and you meet your neighbours. That's what we all want. That's what we all felt during the pandemic, I think. We wanted that community, and we can have better lives in the future, better zero carbon lives in the future, and I've really seen that in all of our projects and through, you know, where I live.
I really think the pandemic's created such an amazing shift on that front as well, that you don't have to necessarily commute to work every day. You might go in once or twice a week, but if you were driving from the country into town, then like that sort of getting to that point of being zero carbon lifestyle is so much more achievable now that we use technology with John somewhere else in the world, and really still being able to connect without having to move around quite so much.
The idea of the 15-minute city, which is becoming such an interesting idea. Yeah. Well, knowledge sharing has been a major theme of this panel discussion. So with that in mind, may I ask you all to think about what you've learned from your fellow panelists that was of interest to you? John, may I ask you, what have you heard in this discussion that you thought that's an idea that I'd like to really pick up and run with?
I just think, you know, picking up on a very common theme throughout the whole session has been around data and sort of better use of data is breaking it down, finding out where the sort of impacts are as part of the project, as part of the construction, as part of the development, and using that data to better inform your decision making.
There you go, Saadia and Brittany. You've got Wates as a client right there. So, Brittany, what have you learned from this panel discussion that you'd like to pick up with?
I think it was something that both of you brought out really early on, this, part of that collaboration piece, but really making sure that we're engaging everyone at every level. So it's not just the government who's setting legislation, it's not just the clients and the contractors who are delivering the outcomes, but actually the individual people who make up that community and who benefit from that space and who need to sort of buy into that net zero lifestyle and sort of repurposing of assets is really important. I think for us at Qflow, we work very much with the contractors and developers, but is there a way that we can work more with individuals within that space just to get them to buy into that sort of circular construction approach? And it's not something we're doing yet, but we'll definitely start looking into it.
And Sue?
Yeah, I think we've got to make it easy for everyone to do all of these things. So I was quite excited to hear about the tools that Brittany and Jake mentioned, and Saadia too. So I'm quite interested to find out more about your tools, which are going to make it easier.
We'll catch up later.
Yeah.
Saadia, what ideas have excited you from this discussion?
I mean, aside from modern methods of the construction that Brittany mentioned, I think what we have to just continually remember is we build buildings for people, and we just can't ignore them as part of the solution. And to continually throw technology at things and expect the technology to do it for the people, I think is only just part of the solution. And we just really have to get people to think about the spaces that they're occupying and involve them in the solution. So, yeah.
Very good. Jake, last word from you.
It was these alternative building materials that you spoke about. Mycelium, was it?
Yeah, mycelium. It's a mushroom.
Yeah. Don't forget the hemline.
I didn't realise they were so close. I thought fabric and materials is not really my strong suit, so I thought we were quite a long way from getting somewhere where you can actually replace these incredibly carbon-intensive materials with something that's more natural. But it's great to hear that we're so close, and we just need someone to make that first step, really, to demonstrate that it can actually be delivered, and we're there. My best friend is a mycelium expert. I'll introduce you to him. Perhaps it says something more about me. So thank you very much.
Sounds like a fun guy. That was terrible.
Well, thanks very much indeed, everybody, for your fantastically creative and powerful insights into the decarbonisation of the buildings and architecture sector. It's clear that we need to build with the environment in mind, and that policy and practices and knowledge sharing need to be a key part of that. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. And we return in around an hour's time to look at the fashion and retail sector, a very different sector, but perhaps with some similar challenges. Thank you very much indeed.